Welcome to Tales from the Bridge. This episode is a special tribute to Greg Bear, who passed away on November 19th, 2022, at 71 years of age. He was one of the great science fiction writers of our time, writing over 50 books, winning multiple Hugo and Nebula Awards, and co-founding the San Diego Comic-Con in 1970. His work is characterized as hard science fiction, with a focus on nanotechnology, biotechnology, accelerated evolution, and quantum computing, and also dealt with sociological and psychological aspects of the human condition, with commentary on cultural practices and the nature of consciousness. We had the great privilege of interviewing Greg about a year ago, and it was one of the most inspiring and interesting conversations we've ever had. We talked about nanotechnology, quantum computing, vaccines, the pandemic, evolution, hominids, and even ghosts, as well as his experience and thoughts about God and the afterlife. That interview is episode 21 from November 2021. And here we've extracted some highlights from our conversation for you to spend a little time with a great man who is no longer with us. And if you want to spend more time with him, that's the magic of books. And there are so many to choose from, a writing career that spanned 55 years and included masterful works like Blood Music, Darwin's Radio, Moving Mars, The Forge of God, and many others. I hope you enjoy this window into Greg's life and thoughts as much as we did. We'll miss you, Greg, and thanks for all that you've given us. And now, let's make our way over to the bridge.
I had an experience about 7 years ago where I had what's called an aortic dissection. Mm-hmm. Which is invariably fatal. Basically, your aorta splits and divides, and suddenly you aren't able to get blood to the brain. And it kills you very quickly. Well, I recognized it at about 12 noon. My wife came over to take a look at me. She called the emergency medical team, and by 4 o'clock that afternoon, after they drove me to a hospital that could do this, they had me sedated, connected to heart-lung machine, split open at the chest, and they put in a new aorta and a titanium valve. And I wasn't there. My lungs were, and they complained mightily thereafter for being pushed aside in this open heart surgery. But I'd never heard of aortic dissection before, and suddenly there I was. And I survived. And I was able to get, so far 4 more books out of my life. And the rest of my family here was able to keep me around for a while. That was not experimental at the time we were doing it, but it was almost experimental. It was a very dangerous procedure, and it involved extraordinary expertise from a surgical team in Seattle area, of which probably only 1 or 2 teams in Seattle could do this sort of thing. And we got to see some of the CAT scans and things like that of my body before this, and I look at that image, 3-dimensional, up and down, and I realized this is a dead man. Until they fixed me up and put in, these robot parts, I was a dead man. I could not survive this. And in fact, most of the emergency medical people that I've spoken to in emergency wards and so on have a graveyard of people who didn't survive. And many of them are aortic dissection victims. Mm-hmm. And so I've been talking with the John Ritter Foundation. He died of an aortic dissection. And apparently the one thing I did right was I recognized this is not a heart attack, but it hurts, and it's not good. And I told that to everyone who treated me. And at one point, a doctor says, this is probably an aortic dissection. This is serious. Call your family. Mm-hmm. Make sure everyone knows about this. Well, I got through it. Mm-hmm. And within a couple of months, I was riding a bicycle until I realized at some point, you're on such a high level of blood thinners, you probably don't want to be riding a bike around. So you have to take compromises with medicine, but it's better than being dead. And this whole vaccine thing reminds me of when I was a kid. I actually kind of had a fit one time in a doctor's office before we got our shots for going to, I think it was Japan. And they gave me the shots anyway, because you had to, if you're going to travel, you have to have these shots. And eventually I got used to them. But every time we took a trip to, say, Kodiak or the Philippines or, anywhere, you had to have these shots. And so I'm pretty used to it by now.
Mm-hmm.
Plus the blood draw, I get a blood draw at least once a month. And so that's another needle. I guess, if you haven't had needles in your life, you may be afraid of them. I can't really be afraid of them. Well, I was pleased to meet Richard Feynman in the 1970s, and kind of followed his career. And he invented quantum computing, or thought about it early on. He invented nanotechnology, or thought about it. Mm-hmm. And my first concept, as I was thinking about nanotechnology, was, well, we already have it. It's called biological molecules. Mm-hmm. They are micro machines, and they're doing proteins are doing amazing work throughout our body every single time. Sometimes at 60 cycles per second, or 60,000 cycles per second. And so that's what's powering us. Mm-hmm. So if we have nanotechnology already, then it's going to be biologically based before it's become silicon based. But for some reason, the people who preferred silicon kind of took the idea forward in books like Engines of Creation and that sort of stuff. And they were quite remarkable in terms of their positing the idea. But I thought to myself, we already have this. We are nanotechnology. Mm-hmm. And it also occurred to me that, a DNA molecule was, in a sense, both a map and a computational system for helping create other cells, other beings, etc. And it's all kind of nested together. And then the way it interconnects in its development, or in our development, is fascinating. And I thought, that's a computational system. It's certainly a thought-based system. I'm not sure that thought and computation are the same thing, though. Mm-hmm. What we have in our brain is not what computers do.
Well, we haven't seen, everybody's been worrying and scared, especially since, the new vaccines are out. People found out that they were carried by nanoparticles. This caused a lot of
every vaccine is carried by nanoparticles. Come on. I think it's fear of needles that propels resistance to the vaccines. A lot of people, at least a fair number of people, 5 or 10%, just don't like needles at all. Right. I think back to one of my favorites, Rachel Maddow, who got the one jab, Johnson & Johnson vaccine, because she didn't like the idea of a second jab. Well, my wife and I both got 2 jabs, and I, as a kid, I was a Navy brat, and so I was used to, not that I approved of it all the time, but I was used to getting shots before we went overseas on my father's tours. And, the last time I got a smallpox vaccination was probably back in the 1960s, early 70s. And, that was all experimental back in the day, but also the flu vaccines, all this sort of stuff. All vaccinations are experimental in a real sense. Mm-hmm. And you're never going to have 100% perfect response. Mm-hmm. But on this one, we haven't gotten COVID yet, and we've had the Pfizer and the Moderna. We're looking forward to the 3rd jab. And, this poor coach who just got fired, he's trying to sue to get his job back. Come on, man. You had a multi-million-dollar a year job for what you loved, and you weren't willing to get a jab with a needle? Yeah. That's fear.
Yeah.
That's deep fear. Yeah, well, in Darwin's Radio, the reason they're protesting is because it involves birth.
Right.
And children and all that stuff. And it turns out in Darwin's Children that it's actually a program to avoid evolution if you can avoid it. And so we can't avoid evolution. But my whole thinking here began about 7 years before I wrote the book, where I really was bearing down hard on biological learning and trying to get up to date on what I thought was going on, because we were coming up on the Human Genome Project. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was going to be pretty fascinating. What were we going to learn? Well, what we were going to learn is we didn't know a lot before. We didn't understand how many genes actually existed. I didn't actually understand how genes were separated and not just linear in the genome, that you had genes and different chromosomes. You had all these things interacting through the various molecular machinery that uses genetics. And helps encode the genetics that keeps us developing as babies, but also that helps us stay alive. and that whole interplex of processes and procedures absolutely fascinated me. And then I asked myself, okay, I know about bacteria having viruses that help them transfer genes, kind of FedEx for genes. What about us? What do we have? And I says, well, I can invent something. And so I invented what I thought would be interesting, and then realized, wait a minute, no, here it is. I read in a textbook. Human endogenous retroviruses are actually transferred, but they're not infectious when they're created. Mm-hmm. But when women give birth, they create a flood of human endogenous retroviruses in the bloodstream, which seem to be used, according to Louis P. Villarreal at UCI, that seem to be used for providing a way for the baby not to trigger the immune response. And I thought, wait a minute, this kind of explains HIV too. This human endogenous, or this virus that tamps down your immune system and triggers it and so on. So where did this come from? And my thought was, okay, bushmeat could have come from a pregnant chimpanzee or some other pregnant, simian. In them, it was the protection against the baby being aborted because of immune system. In us, it's a deadly disease. Mm-hmm. And so let's stay away from bushmeat if we can possibly do so. But it was too late because it had already invaded our society and was on its own way. And the whole thing was both positive and negative. It was astonishing. Okay, this is how we get born. We get born by creating these retroviruses, particles, which are not infectious. They cannot pass easily from one person to another, but they do in the pregnant woman help us get born. But the bad side is that if you mix and match different species, you can get this immune system disaster area. And at that point, I says, oh my gosh, this is the book. We've got a system of FedEx for genes, very much in some respects like what you see in bacteria. And some of these things, these viruses that affect bacteria, are beneficial to the bacteria, and some are deadly to the bacteria. And back in the 20s, the Eliava Institute in Georgia, Republic of Georgia, actually tried to use these bacteriophages that were bad for bacteria to treat wound victims and that sort of thing. And that was a really interesting period of time. And in Russia, it continued into World War II. They would carry vials of these Eliava-phage and try to kill off the bad bacteria that were infecting wounds. That didn't actually work out in our world. It did in Russia, but that was fascinating. So that's why I established part of the story is taking place in Georgia, just for that purpose. What we do see is there are some instances in evolution, and they have been known for generations now, where organisms go through changes that are not random at all, but are dictated by what I didn't talk about in the Darwin's books, which was the overlayer of evolutionary direction, the DNA that controls whether genes are activated or not. And, going into that, that's actually a major thing for evolutionary change. For example, one of my favorite creatures we've seen in our lake often is the water flea, the Daphnia. And the Daphnia are often preyed upon by what are known as phantom midgefly larvae, which are really monstrous-looking creatures. They're kind of like vampire collies, but miniature, only about a half an inch long. But they go after the water fleas. And when they occupy the same water volume as the water fleas acquire a heavier armor. They look quite different as water fleas. Someone back in 1908 might have said, oh, this is a new species. No, but what they do is they wear that armor for a while as long as there are threats, and then they shed it because it's so expensive to process, to create. And when the threat goes away, they shed it. Now that process is not random. That's a regular thing. Sometimes you have insects, stick insects, that develop wings. And then in 2 or 3 generations, they lose the wings. They don't need them anymore. That's not random. What if evolution is a more elaborate and interesting version of that? Where are the secret masters of evolution in our genome? We haven't figured that out. I think we haven't figured it out because mostly evolutionary theory is held up by the Domshansky types. I think what we would see is there is a kind of judgmental system, a creationist system, not creationist, but a system that allows new species to slowly develop and then triggers them. I don't know if that would be what I describe in Darwin's Radio or not, but we've never seen a speciation event in large-scale animals. We see it all the time in bacteria, we see it in viruses, we see it in plants, but we do not see it in creatures like us. And so that's, A, it's a kind of a puzzle, but I'd like to know more. And B, I think if we looked into it deeply without the constraints of the academic conservatives in our society, that we would be able to see this. But what they do is they're desperately afraid of what happened to Darwin, which is, the religious people would come in and say, you're a monster. God is in charge of all of this. Well, I think God kind of subdivides his rights and his rule here to the biological creatures he's created. And part of our system of DNA and of interaction allows for change. And certainly we've seen it, but actually we're kind of a monoculture now in terms of human physiology compared to what we were, 800,000 years ago. There were many species of humans or human-like at that point, and they interacted, and they might have interbred. And that's becoming more and more interesting, is that whole thought pattern of what it was like to be a human being or a near human being 1 million years ago is an amazing process to think about. We've learned recently something that was not allowed when I was doing Darwin's Radio, which is that we have Neanderthal genes. White people, certainly. People came out of Europe have Neanderthal genes. Cro-Magnon is Homo sapiens.
It's Homo sapiens, that's right.
Neanderthals are so close that I'm sure interbreeding occurred. Apparently it did occur because we've got the genes to prove it. But if you go back to that time period, there's just a lot of interaction between different creatures and animals and everything that I find fascinating. And it's part of the ecological system and the story of human evolution is very complex and not simple. And it's not just one species forever and ever. That's kind of a racist attitude, which somehow sticks around in Dobzhansky. We've got superior, which is Cro-Magnon, and we have inferior, which is Neanderthal. But the Neanderthal brain case was slightly larger than the Cro-Magnon brain case. How's that explained? Well, on the other hand, we have these creatures like crows and so on that are very intelligent but don't have huge brains. And how do you explain that? And so I suspect brain size is not the major issue here.
Ever wondered what it takes to make it in the movie business? Peel back the curtain with 4-6 Success Filmmaking. 4-6 Success Filmmaking is where filmmakers share their stories and the secrets.
It's beyond competitive out there.
There have been movies that it's taken me 10 years to get made.
Don't wait to create. You've got to just keep making stuff.
Tune into 4-6 Success Filmmaking for your dose of cinematic realness, direct from the voices that have lived it.
I've heard recently that they've just discovered, surprisingly this late, that the crow brain is actually just a lot more dense. They actually pack a whole lot more neurons per volume into those brains. And I saw what you were just saying in Nature. It was just came out last month that they have a number now for how much Neanderthal DNA we have in us, and it's 20%. 20% in genetics is enormous. I mean, that must have been nothing but interbreeding, basically, to get that much of another species.
Which means that Neanderthal females and males must have been very attractive.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. And it also explains maybe some of the complexity that we live with today, right? In terms of we're a very conflicted species. We have very strange sort of sexual past and history and mores. And maybe it's because we're kind of this combination of two pretty different beings.
We're more like the bonobos than
Yep.
We would like to think. The bonobos have a very interesting sexuality to them. And actually, we've seen them occur in silent films. I believe Thief of Baghdad has a bonobo chimpanzee from 1920s. And I'm fascinated by the fact that they kind of walk like us, they kind of look like us, and they certainly have sexuality like us. So really interesting. We are heading into if we get this quantum computing idea to be a little more solid, although they've got some interesting design developments so far that are moving on at Microsoft and other places, many other places. That will allow you to do in multiple universes what many computers haven't been able to do in one, which is to solve huge, intractable problems across many alternate universes and then pull out the answer later on. And writing about this, there's a textbook coming out pretty shortly on quantum computing, which I wrote a new introduction for. You know, I wonder how much of what who was thinking about the extension of physics in the human mind. It was the
mitochondria. He won a Nobel Prize recently. The Emperor's
not just
New Mind.
mitochondria, but just the whole notion of the neurons accessing basically kind of quantum computing states. I'm not sure that's strictly necessary, but it is interesting, and we can solve many, many problems with these kind of computers. But I'm wondering, and I'm suddenly kind of becoming more open to the possibility, I'm wondering how much the mind is a kind of quantum computing system. Mm-hmm. And what it's, in its intricacy, have we found those connections with access to the alternate universes? Because if we have, I'm going to get a lot weirder in my thinking.
Is it maybe Roger Penrose you're thinking of?
Yeah, Penrose, I'm thinking
the quantum
of.
mind.
Yeah, the quantum mind, and Penrose was. I didn't think that was strictly necessary, but I've had experiences since, which tell me that our whole view of this universe is incomplete. And in fact, that some of the things that we consider to be superstition or spiritualism or whatever may in fact not just be real, but be extremely important. And if that is the case, thank God I'm not a scientist, because I get fired right away. I'd be drummed out of the department if I were doing this. But I've had these experiences over the years involving seeing what people would call ghosts and so on, which I didn't ask for. And I, didn't know quite what to make of them. But they happened. And so as I'm trying to figure them out, I can't figure out the physics of how this works or anything else or what the ultimate outcome would be. I am an unwitting witness to these things, unwilling in some cases. And I can't answer those questions. So if there are unanswered questions out there, that leaves a lot of space for thinking about things, for being a writer, for trying to figure out what being a human being means, for being what it means when you end being a human being. If you're a quantum observer, if you're helping flip the state on reality by staring at it as we would have in some of these systems, if you are determining what is real and what is not, what happens when you die? Does that stop? If it does, how does it stop? How long can it continue? I'm old enough that I've been through enough crap that it's kind of time to start thinking in the long term over what's happening next. And I don't know.
Maybe
I don't think
It's fascinating.
It's a mystery, and it's going to be an adventure,
Well, maybe the universe conspires to make sure you don't stop observing, and this is the basis of the afterlife. There's a conservation of observation law that maybe we'll find.
There you go. That's what I should have called it back then. But you're going to keep making these decisions even after you're gone.
Yeah, your Wikipedia page says that you are a theist, and I think that's wonderful. I mean, I'm certainly a mystic, and I'm a scientist with a pretty open mind about what's possible, because I think it's important to listen to the witnesses that through all of history who have witnessed things, right? And they're telling us this is data. This is, you can't just say, no, I don't think it's true. I'm just going to ignore everything that anybody ever said about their
this whole arrogance, this arrogance of people who believe in God are irrational. 97% of people believe in God.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to discount all of them. They may not be right in their theories about God, but then none of us may be. So I had an experience in 2000 of flying out to the FBI Academy. And on the airplane, I suddenly realized that I was being spoken to. I had a cold river feeling down the back of my head. And that went on for a month. And it was a contact with something that did not agree with being called God, but that I thought was certainly in that possibility. And that went on for 30 days. And, that's longer than most of us have a chance to interact.
Wow.
And one of my favorite stories of this sort of thing is in one of the Encyclopedia Britannica volumes on Aquinas, where the afterword says that Aquinas, after writing all of these theological books, was giving a speech. And he suddenly stopped in the middle of the speech, looked out over them, and just kind of got a blank look on his face and walked back to his room. And one of the monks came to him and said later, well, what happened, sir? And Aquinas says, I have been afforded such knowledge as makes all my work so far wrong. And he says, I can't explain beyond that. And so if what I experienced was what Aquinas experienced, what Aquinas had done was try to create an entire world system around God. And what God very lovingly perhaps had done was to tell him, nope, sorry, you got it wrong. Here's what's going on. And then touched his brain. And if that was what happened to me, I kind of pity poor Aquinas. Although he spent years afterwards, perhaps, trying to equate new mystical theories, he was definitely a theoretician and an amazing man and a very popular and friendly man. But what happened to him? What happens to us when this happens to us? I spent 30 days on that, and it kind of gradually faded out. But how did that change me? Was I being, like Harry Seldon giving me advice or whatever? Was this what was going on? I have no idea. But that certainly made it impossible for me. And I didn't believe in atheism before that. But that made it impossible for me to be an atheist. This was before, quite a ways before I had my experience, since it was started in the early 1990s. But, I'm willing to keep an open mind. I don't have the answers, and I think I never have had the answers. And having these experiences does not give me necessarily any major answers. But in terms of afterlife and all that kind of stuff, I have no idea. I can't explain it, and I certainly can't explain it scientifically. I suspect that our science, and I actually, Arthur C. Clarke was kind of writing about this when he wrote about, as far as ghosts go, he says, we may know what they are eventually. We don't know what they are now, but they may have a scientific basis. Possibly. I just don't know. The current science is probably 1,000 years, 2,000 years behind understanding these sorts of things, which brings me back to being, Isaac Asimov again. Isaac was an atheist. He did not believe any of this stuff. And yet he wrote science fiction. And science fiction, for people like Arthur C. Clarke, who was one of his good friends, science fiction is a kind of a thinking about things beyond what we understand today. And that is where we should all be, with humility and with patience and understanding, because a lot of people really have a hard time dealing with this and are really hopeful that they will live forever in the current form of their existence. That I don't think is going to happen. But what comes thereafter, I don't know.
Well, I think this network view of the world that you expressed here, and I mean, I think I've read you say we're a bunch of overlapping networks of different things, right? Our immune system is a network. Our
the immune system is a kind of brain,
it's a kind of brain, yeah. and our microbe, right? Our the microbial communities that live with us, I mean, are also another kind of network, and our brain is another kind of network. So, I think the circle that we draw that says this is myself, right, is kind of an artificial thing around very different components that are made of different stuff and interacting. So what if that circle, when you die, it gets drawn around yet a different, larger network, right? Like these
Could be
networks
interesting, yeah.
go up and down scale.
Yeah.
So maybe we're in the motions of the trees, or the grass.
Certainly sounds poetic, doesn't it?
Right. Well, thank you for reflecting on that.
My pleasure talking to you guys.
Yeah. It's been a real pleasure meeting you and talking to you, and we wish you all the best. Hopefully we can maybe talk to you again one day after your next project.
That sounds good. I'm working on a memoir now, so if it ever gets published, we can talk about that.
Oh, well, that's
nice.
perfect. Great. We would love to read that and then have another chat.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, guys.
All right.